We have been talking about adaptation, but we haven't talked about some of the practical implications of how this is done. So if we think about adaptation in practice, then we need several specific concepts that go into how adaptation is going to be conceived, implemented, and what the potential opportunities, constraints, and actually limits are. So I'm going to go through in detail all this text, but you should read on your own as well. Defining the adaptation gap. In many cases, nations and communities are inadequately equipped to adapt to current vulnerabilities. Let's say Bangladesh, it's sitting there at sea level being very vulnerable, but it cannot move millions of its people as a measure of adaptation, for example. And those things happen because of problems such as poverty, resource scarcity, and adaptive responses need to cope with the current baseline climate variability as well as future changes. So it's not like you are only planning for future changes, but you are already vulnerable to current variability, which could very well be just natural variability, and the global warming impacts haven't shown up yet. Of course, sea level has already risen and the impacts have already shown up for Bangladesh, but there may be situations where that's not the case. The problem definition is going to be important because the responses depend fundamentally on what kind of things need to be adapted to. What are we trying to adapt to? In most contexts, adaptation is needed to changes in the mean state conditions and also to extreme events, but the specific climatic threats may vary from context to context. So coming back to the South Asian region, it could be a decrease in the mean monsoon over the monsoon season associated with extreme events which cause widespread floods as well as extreme droughts in other regions. So at the same time you have some part of the country having extreme floods and other country having droughts. And the mean rainfall is overall decreasing as well. The response options. What does adaptation mean in practice in a given context? So this is local, information needed is local, and the context in which this adaptation happens is also very local. It may involve institutional and infrastructure modifications, such as changes in business practices, building design, or land planning, for example, moving away from the coasts, but it also involves other measures to improve society's preparedness for the increased likelihood of adverse conditions. A state like Kerala, for example, got hit with massive floods in 2018, I think, and then it got hit again in 2019 and 2020, and the land use change on the Western Ghats have started to create landslides, replacing with natural vegetation with monocrops like rubber plantations and so on, can add to these vulnerability to heavy rain events that are associated with the ocean warming and overall global warming as well. The timing of adaptation. Decisions about when to adapt require the identification of appropriate lead times to allow planning over correct time scale. Ideally, planning also includes flexibility to allow for the modification of adaptation as more information, for example, better forecasts that we talked about in terms of the intermodal differences in precipitation projections and so on, become available as we are going forward. So the planning has to be flexible enough. Integration of adaptation. So in this case, decisions are needed about the extent to which adaptation is addressed as a specific policy issue in its own right, compared with the efforts at mainstreaming adaptation into business as usual planning. So are you trying to adapt so that you can continue to operate as you wish to, or are you actually going to have fundamental changes in the mode of operation of businesses, of building codes, of where to live, where to grow food, maybe moving crops or changing crop selections, and so on and so forth. Okay? So this is a nice conceptual model looking at the intensity of adverse impacts going from negligible impacts to catastrophic impacts, and the frequency of adverse impacts being very rare to very frequent, and it gives you corners where the risk is basically acceptable, at least at a given time. It can change over time. For example, you can move from negligible intensity of adverse impacts towards catastrophic, or you can move from very rare to more frequent, which is what happens with the loaded climate dice that we talked about. And you have these phase spaces where tolerable risk exists in this middle, and so there are risks, but they are essentially tolerable, which means your capacity to adapt allows you to live with these risks. And then there are adaptation limits because of limitations, because of opportunities, because of constraints, and so on. And you get into this corner where basically the risks are intolerable. So you have to be either in the range of managing the unavoidable or avoiding the unmanageable. So this would become the unmanageable, which you would want to avoid, which is not always in your control. For example, land warming over India is not directly associated with extreme rainfall, and when extreme rainfall does happen, the moisture is coming from the ocean, for example from the Arabian Sea, which is warming. So India can do a lot to take care of the floods and natural defenses and other things, but it cannot directly control ocean warming, which is part of the global dynamics of global warming. Okay, so there are those kinds of issues as well. Going back to the IPCC, definitions of adaptation, opportunities, constraints, and limits. So adaptation opportunities are factors that make it easier to plan and implement adaptation actions, that expand adaptation options, or that provide ancillary co-benefits. Okay, so these factors enhance the ability of an actor to secure their existing objectives, or for a natural system to retain productivity or functioning. It depends on food production system or particular industrial activity and so on. Okay, so for instance, increased public awareness and support for adaptation, availability of additional resources from actors at other levels of governance to overcome constraints, and soft limits, which are changeable things. Hard limits are, as I said, Arabian Sea warming. You are not going to be able to change it, or you're not going to change the extent of the coast, and so on and so forth. And interest in acquiring co-benefits arising from adaptation strategies can all facilitate adaptation planning and implementation. And there are other details here. Of course, there are adaptation opportunities, sometimes also referred to as adaptation enablers, that are distinct from opportunities arising from climate change itself, in terms of, let's say, longer growing season because of the warming, winter ending earlier, spring arriving earlier, growing season getting longer. They are commonly referred to as potential benefits of climate change or adaptation options. What about adaptation constraints? These are factors that make it harder to plan and implement adaptation actions. So adaptation constraints restrict the variety and effectiveness of options for actors to secure their existing objectives, or for a natural system to change in ways that maintain its productivity and functioning. Okay, the terms barrier and obstacles are generally used synonymously. Constraints alone or in combination can drive an actor or a natural system, let's say like a forest, to an adaptation limit. So there are those kinds of constraints. So then adaptation limit is basically the point at which an actor's objectives or system's needs cannot be secured from intolerable risks through adaptive actions. Okay, there are hard adaptation limit, like no adaptive action are possible to avoid intolerable risks in these cases. So It's like, let's say, sea level rise is making it impossible to live near the coast and protect against storm surge, inundation, and so on. Then you have to move inland. That's just a limitation. Soft adaptation limits, where options are currently not available to avoid intolerable risks through adaptive action. Okay, so those kind of details have to be kept in mind when we talk about adaptation opportunities, constraints, and limits. There is also the concept of adaptation gap. There is some action that is within reach, but the country just doesn't have, let's say, the financial resources to make it happen. So how will this work in the global context, or in the regional context, or in the context of disparities of climate impacts, where a country that's not a major contributor is suffering, or there are climate injustices where, let's say, upper echelons of the socioeconomic strata are protecting themselves and leaving the vulnerable ones to their own devices. So there can be adaptation gaps as well that have to be taken care of.